According to Gottlieb, footnote 36, a, quote, very small dose, end quote, of LSD was placed in a bottle of Cointreau, which was served after dinner on Thursday, November 19th. The drug was placed in the liquor by Robert Lashbrook. All but 2 of the SOD participants received LSD. One did not drink. The other had a heart condition. Footnote 37. About 20 minutes after they finished their Cointreau, Gottlieb informed the other participants that they had received LSD. Dr. Gottlieb stated that, quote, up to the time of the experiment, end quote, he observed nothing unusual in Dr. Olson's behavior. Footnote 37a. Once the experiment observed nothing unusual in Dr. Olson's behavior, once the experiment was underway, Gottlieb recalled that, quote, the drug had a definite effect on the group to the point that they were boisterous and laughing, and they could not continue the meeting or engage in sensible conversation, end quote. The meeting continued until about 1 o'clock a.m., when the participants retired for the evening. Gottlieb recalled that Olson, among others, complained of, quote, wakefulness, end quote, during the night. Footnote 38. According to Gottlieb, on Friday morning, quote, aside from some evidence of fatigue, I observed nothing unusual in Olson's actions, conversation, or general behavior, end quote. Footnote 39. Rouet recalls that Olson, quote, appeared to be agitated, end quote, at breakfast, but he, quote, did not consider this to be abnormal under the circumstances, end quote. Footnote 40. Subsection C. The following Monday, November 23rd, Olson was waiting for Rouet when he came into work at 7:30 a.m. For the next 2 days, Olson's friends and family attempted to reassure him and help him, quote, snap out, end quote, of what appeared to be a serious depression. On Tuesday, Olson again came to Rouet and, after an hour-long conversation, end of page 79, beginning of page 78, it was decided that medical assistance for Dr. Olson was desirable. Footnote 41. Returning to page 78, I will read the footnotes. Footnote 36. Memorandum of Sheffield Edwards for the record. November 2853, page 2. Footnote 37. Lashbrook. Staff Summary. July 19th, 75, page 3. Footnote 37a. Gottlieb Memorandum. December 7th, 53, page 2. Footnote 38. Edwards Memorandum. November 28th, 53, page 3. Footnote 39. Gottlieb Memorandum. December 7th, 53, page 3. Footnote 40. Rouet Memorandum, page 3. Returning to page 80. Rouet then called Lashbrook and informed him that, quote, Dr. Olson was in serious trouble and needed immediate professional attention, end quote. Footnote 42. Lashbrook agreed to make appropriate arrangements and told Rouet to bring Olson to Washington, D.C. Rouet and Olson proceeded to Washington to meet with Lashbrook, and the three left for New York at about 2:30 p.m. to meet with Dr. Harold Abramson. At that time, Dr. Abramson was an allergist and immunologist practicing medicine in New York City. He held no degree in psychiatry, but was associated with research projects supported indirectly by the CIA. Gottlieb and Lashbrook both followed his work closely in the early 1950s. Footnote 43. Since Olson needed medical help, they turned to Dr. Abramson as the doctor closest to Washington, who was experienced with LSD and clearly by the CIA. Ruett, Lashbrook, and Olson remained in New York for 2 days of consultations with Abramson. On Thursday, November 26, 1953, the three flew back to Washington so that Olson could spend Thanksgiving with his family. En route from the airport, Olson told Ruett that he was afraid to face his family. After a lengthy discussion, it was decided that Olson and Lashbrook would return to New York, and that Ruett would go to Frederick to explain these events to Mrs. Olson. Footnote 44. Lashbrook and Olson flew back to New York the same day, again, for consultations with Abramson. They spent Thursday night in a Long Island hotel, and the next morning returned to the city with Abramson. In further discussions with Abramson, it was agreed that Olson should be placed under regular psychiatric care at an institution closer to his home. Footnote 45. Subsection D. The death. Because they could not obtain air transportation for a return trip on Friday night, Lashbrook and Olson made reservations for Saturday morning and checked into the Statler Hotel. Between the time they checked in and 10 o'clock p.m., they watched television, visited the cocktail lounge where each had 2 martinis and dinner. According to Lashbrook, Olson, quote, was cheerful and appeared to enjoy the entertainment, end quote. He, quote, appeared no longer particularly depressed, and almost the Dr. Olson I knew prior to the experiment, end quote. Footnote 46. After dinner, Lashbrook and Olson watched television for about an hour, and at 11 o'clock, Olson suggested that they go to bed, saying that, quote, he felt more relaxed and contented that he had since they came out to New York, end quote. Footnote 47. Olson then left a call with the hotel operator to wake them in the morning. At approximately 2:30 a.m. Saturday, November 28th, Lashbrook was awakened by a loud, quote, crash of glass, end quote. In his report on the incident, he stated only that Olson, quote, had crashed through the closed window, blind, and the closed window, and he fell to his death from the window of our room on the 10th floor, end quote. Footnote 48. On to the footnotes. Footnote 41, IBID, page 4. Footnote 42, Lashbrook Memorandum, December 7th, 53, page 1. Footnote 43, Staff Summary of Dr. Harold Abramson Interview, July 29th, 75, page 2. Footnote 44, Lashbrook Memorandum, December 7th, 53, page 3. Footnote 45, Abramson Memorandum, December 4th, 53. Footnote 46, Lashbrook Memorandum, December 7th, 53, page 3. Footnote 47, IBID, page 4. Footnote 48, IBID. End of page 80. Beginning of page 81. Immediately after finding that Olson had leapt to his death, Lashbrook telephoned Gottlieb at his home and informed him of the incident. Footnote 49. Gottlieb called Rouet and informed him of Olson's death at approximately 2:45 a.m. Footnote 50. Lashbrook then called the hotel desk and reported the incident to the operator there. Lashbrook called Abramson and informed him of the occurrence. Abramson told Lashbrook he, quote, wanted to be kept out of the thing completely, end quote, but later changed his mind and agreed to assist Lashbrook. Footnote 51. Shortly after, uniformed police officers and some hotel employees came to Lashbrook's room. Lashbrook told the police he didn't know why Olson had committed suicide, but he did know that Olson, quote, suffered from ulcers, end quote. Footnote 52. Subsection E. The aftermath. Following Dr. Olson's death, the CIA made a substantial effort to ensure that his family received death benefits, but did not notify the Olsons of the circumstances surrounding his demise. The agency also made considerable efforts to prevent the death being connected with the CIA, and supplied complete cover for Lashbrook so that his association with the CIA would remain a secret. After Dr. Olson's death, the CIA conducted an internal investigation of the incident. As part of his responsibilities in this investigation, the General Counsel wrote the Inspector General, stating, I am not happy with what seems to be a very casual attitude on the part of TSS representatives to the way this experiment was conducted, and the remarks that this is just one of the risks running with the scientific experimentation. I do not eliminate the need for taking risks, but I do believe, especially when human health or life is at stake, that at least the prudent, reasonable measures which can be taken to minimize the risk must be taken, and failure to do so was culpable negligence. The actions of the various individuals concerned after effects of the experiment on Dr. Olson became manifest, also revealed the failure to observe normal and reasonable precautions. Footnote 53. As a result of the investigation, DCI Alan Dulles sent a personal letter to the Chief of Technical Operations of the Technical Services staff, who had approved the experiment, criticizing him for, quote, poor judgment in authorizing the use of this drug on such an unwitting basis and without proximate medical safeguards, end quote. Footnote 54. Dulles also sent a letter to Dr. Gottlieb, Chief of Chemical Division of Technical Services staff, criticizing him for recommending the, quote, unwitting application of the drug, end quote, in that the proposal, quote, did not give sufficient emphasis for medical collaboration and for the proper consideration of the rights of the individual to whom it was being administered, end quote. Footnote 55. Reading the footnotes. Footnote 49. CIA Field Office Report, December 3rd, 53, page 3. Footnote 50. Rouet Memorandum, page 11. Footnote 51. CIA Field Office Report, December 3rd, 53, page 3. Footnote 52. IBID. Footnote 53. Memorandum from the General Counsel to the Inspector General, January 4th, 54. Footnote 54. Memorandum from DCI to Chief, Technical Operations, TSS, February 12th, 54. Footnote 55. Memorandum from DCI to Sidney Gottlieb, February 12th, 54. End of page 81. Beginning of page 52. Excuse me. Beginning of page 82. The letters were handed to the individual to be read and returned. Although the letters were critical, a note from the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence to Mr. Helms instructed him to inform the individuals that, quote, "These are not reprimands and no personnel file notation are being made," end quote. Footnote 56. Thus, although the Rockefeller Commission has characterized them as such, these notes were explicitly not reprimands, nor did participation in the events which led to Dr. Olson's death have any apparent effect on the advancement within the CIA of the individuals involved. Section 3. The surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting, non-volunteer human subjects by the CIA after the death of Dr. Olson. The death of Dr. Olson could be viewed, as some argued at the time, as a tragic accident. One of the risks inherent in the testing of new substances, it might be argued that LSD was thought to be benign. After the death of Dr. Olson, the dangers of the surreptitious administration of LSD were clear, yet the CIA continued or initiated. Footnote 57. A project involving the surreptitious administration of LSD to non-volunteer human subjects. The program exposed numerous individuals in the United States to the risk of death or serious injury without their informed consent, without medical supervision, and without necessary follow-up to determine any long-term effects. Prior to the Olson experiment, the Director of Central Intelligence had approved MKULTRA, a research program designed to develop a, quote, capability in the covert use of biological and chemical agent materials, end quote. In the proposal describing MKUltra, Mr. Helms, then ADDP, wrote the director that we intend to investigate the development of a chemical material which causes a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state, the specific nature of which can be reasonably well predicted for each individual. This material could potentially aid in discrediting individuals, eliciting information, and implanting suggestions and other forms of mental control. Footnote 58. One moment. On February 12, 1954, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency wrote TSS officials, criticizing them for, quote, poor judgment, end quote, in administering LSD on, quote, an unwitting basis and without proximate medical safeguards, end quote, to Dr. Olson, and for the lack of, quote, proper consideration of the rights of the individual to whom it was being administered, end quote. Footnote 59. On the same day, the Inspector General reviewed a report on subproject number 3 of MKUltra, in which the same TSA officers who had just received letters from the director were quoted as stating that one of the purposes of subproject 3 was to, end of page 82, beginning of page 83, quote, observe the behavior of unwitting persons being questioned after having been given a drug, end quote. Footnote 60. Returning to page 82 to read the footnotes. Footnote 56. Note from DDCI, to Richard Helms. February 13th, 54. Footnote 57. The 1963 IG report, which described the project involving the surreptitious administration of LSD, placed the project beginning in 1955. Other CIA documents reveal that it was in existence as early as February 1954. The CIA has told the committee that the project began in 1953 and that the experiment which led to Dr. Olson's death was part of the project. Footnote 58. Memorandum from ADDP items to DCI dollars. April 3rd, 53. Tab A, page 2. Footnote 59. Memorandum from DCI to Sidney Gottlieb, February 12th, 54. And Memorandum from DCI to Chief of Operations, TSS, February 12th, 54. Returning to page 83. There is no evidence that subproject number 3 was terminated, even though these officers were unequivocally aware of the dangers of the surreptitious administration of LSD and the necessity of obtaining informed consent and providing medical safeguards. Subproject number 3, in fact, used methods which showed even less concern than did the Olson experiment for the safety and security of the participants. Yet the evidence indicates the project continued until 1963. Footnote 61. In the project, the individual conducting the test might make initial contact with a prospective subject selected at random in a bar. He would then invite the person to a, quote, safe house, end quote, where the test drug was administered to the subject through drink or in food. CIA personnel might debrief the individual conducting the test or observe the test by using a one-way mirror and tape recorder in an adjoining room. Prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. There was also obviously no medical pre-screening. In addition, the tests were conducted by individuals who were not qualified scientific observers. There were no medical personnel on hand either to administer the drugs or to observe their effects, and no follow-up was conducted on the test subjects. As the Inspector General noted in 1963, a significant limitation on the effectiveness of such testing is the infeasibility of performing scientific observation of results. The individuals conducting the tests are not qualified scientific observers. Their subjects are seldom accessible beyond the first hours of the test. The testing may be useful in perfecting delivery techniques and in identifying surface characteristics of onset, reaction, attribution, and side effect. Footnote 62. This was particularly troublesome as, in a number of instances, the test subjects has become ill for hours or days, including hospitalization in at least one case, and the agent could only follow up by guarded inquiry after the test subjects returned to normal life. Possible sickness and attendant economic loss are inherent contingent effects of the testing. Footnote 63. Paradoxically, greater care seems to have been taken for the safety of foreign nationals against whom LSD was used abroad. In several cases, medical examinations were performed prior to the use of LSD. Footnote 64. Reading the footnotes. Footnote 60. Memorandum to the Inspector General from Chief. Inspection and review on subproject number 3 of MKULTRA, February 10th, 54. Footnote 61. IG report on MKULTRA, 1963. Footnote 62. IBID, page 12. Footnote 63. IBID. According to the IG's survey in 1963, physicians associated with MKUltra could be made available in an emergency. Footnote 64. The Technical Services Division, which was responsible for the operational use of LSD abroad, took the position that, quote, no physical examination of the subject is required prior to the administration of, in brackets, LSD, brackets, by TSS trained personnel. And then it cuts off. I'm going to scroll down briefly. I'm going to scroll down to the footnotes of page 84 because that's where it continues. A physician need not be present. There is no danger medically in the use of this material as handled by TSS trained personnel, end quote. The Office of Medical Services had taken the position that LSD was, quote, medically dangerous, end quote. Both the Office of Security and the Office of Medical Services argued that LSD, quote, should not be administered unless preceded by a medical examination, and should be administered only by or in the presence of a physician who had studied it and its effect, end quote. Memorandum from James Angleton, Chief Counterintelligence Staff to Chief of Operations, December 12th, 57, pages 1 to 2. Beginning page 84. Moreover, the administration abroad was marked by constant observation, made possible because the material was being used against prisoners of foreign intelligence or security organizations. Finally, during certain of the LSD interrogations abroad, local physicians were on call, though these physicians had had no experience with LSD and would not be told that hallucinogens had been administered. Footnote 65. The CIA's project involving the surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting human subjects in the United States was finally halted in 1963 as a result of its discovery during the course of an Inspector General learned of the project. During the course of an Inspector General survey of the Technical Services Division. When the Inspector General learned of the project, he spoke to the Deputy Director for Plans, who agreed that the Director should be briefed. The DDP made it clear that the DCI and his deputy were generally familiar with MKUltra. He indicated, however, that he was not sure it was necessary to brief the DDCI at that point. On May 24, 1963, the DDP advised the Inspector General that he had briefed the Director on MKUltra program, and in particular had covered the question of the surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting human subjects. According to the Inspector General, the DDP said that, quote, the director indicated no disagreement and therefore the, quote, testing, end quote, will continue, end quote. Footnote 66. One copy of an, quote, eyes only, end quote, draft report on MKUltra was prepared, by the Inspector General, who recommended the termination of the surreptitious administration project. The project was suspended following the Inspector General's report. On December 17, 1963, Deputy Director for Plans, Helms, wrote a memo to the DDCI, who, with the Inspector General and the Executive Director Comptroller, had opposed the covert testing. He noted two aspects of the problem. One, quote, for over a decade, the clandestine services has had the mission of manifesting a capability for influencing human behavior, end quote. And two, quote, testing arrangements in furtherance of this mission should be as operationally realistic and yet as controllable as possible, end quote. Helms argued that the individuals must be, quote, unwitting, end quote, as this was, quote, the only realistic method of maintaining the capability, considering the intended operational use of materials to influence human behavior, as the operational targets will certainly be unwitting. Should the subjects of this testing not be unwitting, the program would only be, quote, pro forma, end quote, resulting in a, quote, false sense of accomplishment and readiness, end quote. Footnote 67. Helms continued. That's the end of page 84, onto page 85. If one grants the validity of the mission of maintaining this unusual capability and the necessity for unwitting testing, there is only then the question of how best to do it. Obviously, the testing should be conducted in such a manner as to permit the opportunity to observe the results of the administration on the target. It also goes without saying that whatever testing arrangement we adopt must afford maximum safeguards for the protection of the agency's role in this activity, as well as minimizing the possibility of physical or emotional damage to the individual tested. Footnote 68. I will return to page 85 to read the footnotes. Footnote 65. Physicians might be called with the hope that they would make a diagnosis of mental breakdown, which would be useful in discrediting the individual who was the subject of the CIA interest. Footnote 66. Memorandum for the record prepared by the Inspector General, May 15, 63, page 1. Footnote 67, IBID, page 2. End of page 84. I intend to continue this recording, but I will be taking a break for now. In another memo to the Director of Central Intelligence in June 1964, Helms again raised the issue of unwitting testing. At the time, General Carter, then acting DCI, approved several changes in the MKUltra program proposed by Mr. Helms as a result of negotiations between the Inspector General and the DDP. In a handwritten note, however, Director Carter added that, quote, unwitting testing will be subject to a separate decision, end quote. Footnote 69. No specific decision was made then or soon after. The testing had been halted, and according to Walter Elder, executive assistant to DCI McClone, the DCI was not inclined to take the positive step of authorizing a resumption of the testing. At least through the summer, the DDPI did not press the issue. On November 9, 1964, the DDP raised the issue again in a memo to the DCI, calling the director's attention to what he described as, quote, several other indications during the past year of an apparent associate aggressiveness in the field of covertly administered chemicals, which are, to say the least, inexplicable and disturbing, end quote. Footnote 70. Helms noted that because of the suspension of covert testing, the agency's, quote, positive operational capability to use drugs is diminishing, owing a lack of realistic testing. With increasing knowledge of the state of the art, we are less capable of staying up with Soviet advances into this field. This in turn results in a warning capability on our part to restrain others in the intelligence community, such as the Department of Defense, from pursuing operations in this area, end quote. Footnote 71. Helms attributed the cessation of the unwitting testing to the high risk of embarrassment to the agency, as well as the, quote, moral problem, end quote. He noted that no better covert situation had been devised than that which had been used, and that, quote, we have no answer to the moral issue, end quote. Footnote 72. Helms asked for either resumption of the testing project or its definitive cancellation. He argued that the status quo of the research and development program without a realistic testing program was causing the agency to live, quote, with the illusion of a capability which is becoming minimal and furthermore is expensive, end quote. Footnote 73. Once again, no formal action was taken in response to the Helms request. On to the footnotes. Footnote 68. Memorandum from DDP Helms to DDCI Carter, December 17th, 63. Footnote 69. Memorandum from DDP Helms to DCI, June 9th, 64, page 3. Footnote 70. IBID, November 9th, 64, page 1. 71. IBID, pages 1 through 2. Footnote 72. IBID, page 2. Footnote 73. IBID. End of page 85. Beginning of page 86. From its beginning in the early 1950s until its termination in 1963, the program of surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting non-volunteer human subjects demonstrates a failure of the CIA's leadership to pay adequate attention to the rights of individuals and to provide effective guidance to CIA employees. Though it was known that the testing was dangerous, the lives of subjects were placed in jeopardy and their rights were ignored during the 10 years of testing which followed Dr. Olson's death. Although it was clear that the laws of the United States were being violated, the testing continued. While the individuals involved in the Olson experiment were admonished by the director, at the same time they were also told that they were not being reprimanded and that their, quote, bad judgment, end quote, would not be made part of their personal records. When the covert testing project was terminated in 1963, none of the individuals involved were subject to any disciplinary action. 4. Monitoring and control of the testing and use of chemical and biological agents by the CIA. The Select Committee found numerous failures in the monitoring and control of the testing and use of chemical and biological agents within the CIA. Footnote 74. An analysis of the failures can be divided into 4 sections. A. The waiver of normal regulations or requirements. B. The problems in authorization procedures. C. The failure of internal review mechanisms such as the Office of General Counsel, the Inspector General, and the audit staff. And D. The effect of compartmentation and competition within the CIA. Section A. The waiver of administrative controls. The internal controls within any agency rests on 1. Clear and coherent regulations. 2. Clear lines of authority. And 3. Clear rewards for those who conduct themselves in accord with agency regulations, and understandable and immediate sanctions against those who do not. In the case of the testing and use of chemical and biological agents, normal CIA administrative controls were waived. The destruction of the documents on the largest CIA program in this area constituted a prominent example of the waiver of normal agency procedures by the director. These documents were destroyed in early 1973 at the order of then DCI Richard Helms. According to Helms, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, then director of TSD, quote, came to me and said that he was retiring and that I was retiring, and he thought it would be a good idea if these files were destroyed. And I also believe part of the reason for our thinking this was advisable was there had been relationships with outsiders in government agencies and other organizations that these would be sensitive in this kind of a thing, but that since the program was over and finished and done with, we thought we would just get rid of the files as end of page 86, beginning of page 87 as well, so that anybody who assisted us in the past would not be subject to follow-up or questions, embarrassment, if you will. Footnote 75. Returning to page 86 to read the footnote. Footnote 74, Section 2(9) of Senate Resolution 21 instructs the committee to examine the, quote, extent to which United States intelligence agencies are governed by executive orders, rules, or regulations, either published or secret, end quote. Returning to page 87. The destruction was based on a waiver of an internal CIA regulation, CSI 7010, which regulated the, quote, retirement of inactive records, end quote. As Thomas Karamessines, then Deputy Director of Plans, wrote in Regulation CSI 7010, quote, retirement is not a matter of convenience or of storage, but of conscious judgment in the application of the rules modified by knowledge of individual components needed. The heart of this judgment is to ensure that the complete story can be reconstructed in later years and by people who may be unfamiliar with these events, end quote. Footnote 76. The destruction of the MKUltra documents made it impossible for the Select Committee to determine the full range and extent of the largest CIA research program involving chemical and biological agents. The destruction also prevented the CIA from locating and providing medical assistance to individuals who were subjects in the program. Finally, it prevented the committee from determining the full extent of the operations which made use of the materials developed in the MKUltra program. Footnote 77. From the inception of MKUltra, normal agency procedures were waived. In 1953, Mr. Helms, then Assistant Deputy Director for Plans, proposed the establishment of MKUltra. Under the proposal, 6% of the research and development budget of TSD would be expended, quote, without the establishment of formal contractual relations, end quote, because contracts would reveal government interests. Helms also voted that the qualified individuals in the field, quote, are most reluctant to enter into signed agreements with any sort which connect them with this activity, since such a connection would jeopardize their professional reputations. End quote. Footnote 78. That was the end of page 87, and reputations started or continued in page 88. I'm returning to page 87 to read the footnotes. Footnote 75. Richard Helms' testimony, September 11th, 1975, page 5. Many agent documents recording confidential relationships with individuals and organizations are retained without public disclosure. Moreover, in the case of MKUltra, the CIA has spent millions of dollars developing both materials and delivery systems, which could be used by the clandestine services. The reconstruction of this research and development program would be difficult, if not impossible, without the documents. And at least one assistant to Dr. Gottlieb protested against the document destruction on those grounds. Footnote 76. Clandestine Services Institution, CSI 70-10, when asked by the Select Committee about the regularity of the procedure by which he authorized Dr. Gottlieb to destroy the MKUltra records, Helm responded, quote, "Well, that's hard to say whether it would be part of the regular procedure or not, because the record destruction program is conducted according to a certain pattern. There is a regular destruction pattern in the agency monitored by certain people and done in a certain way. So that anything outside of that, I suppose, would have been unusual. In other words, there were documents being destroyed because somebody had raised a specific issue, rather than because they were encompassed in the regular records destruction program. So I think the answer to your question is probably yes." End quote. Helms' testimony, September 11th, 75, page 6. Footnote 77. Even prior to the destruction of the documents, the MKUltra records were far from complete. As the Inspector General noted in 1963, quote, files are notably incomplete, poorly organized, and lacking in evaluate statements that might give perspective to management policies over time. A substantial proportion of the MKUltra record appears to rest in the memories of principal officers and is therefore almost certain to be lost with their departures. End quote. IG report on MKUltra, page 23. That is the end of page 87. Resuming page 88. Other agency procedures, i.e., the forwarding of documents in support of invoices and the provision for regular audit procedures, were also to be waived. On April 13, 1953, the then DCI Ellen Dulles approved MKUltra, noting that security considerations precluded handling the project through usual contractual agreements. 10 years later, investigations of CIA by both the Inspector General and the audit staff noted substantial deficiencies which resulted from the waivers, because TSD had not reserved the rights to audit the books of contractors in MKUltra. The CIA had been unable to verify the use of agency grants by a contractor. Another firm had failed to establish controls and safeguards which would assure, quote, proper accountability, end quote, in use of government funds, with the result that, quote, funds have been used for purposes not contemplated by grants or allowable under usual contract relationship, end quote. Footnote 79. The entire MKUltra arrangement was condemned for having administrative lines which were unclear, overly permissive controls, and irresponsible supervision. The head of the audit branch noted that inspections and audits led us to see MKUltra as frequently having provided a device to escape normal administrative controls for research that is not especially sensitive, as having allowed practices that produce gross administrative failures, as having permitted the establishment of special relations with unreliable organizations on an unacceptable basis, and as having produced on at least one occasion a cavalier treatment of bona fide contracting organization. While admitting that there may be a need for special mechanisms for handling sensitive projects, the chief of the audit branch wrote that, quote, both the terms of reference and the ground rules for handling such special projects should be spelled out in advance so that diversion from normal channels does not mean abandonment of controls. Special procedures may be necessary to ensure the security of highly sensitive operations, to prevent the erosion of normal internal control mechanisms, such as waivers. Such waivers should not be extended to less sensitive operations. Moreover, only those regulations which would endanger security should be waived. To waive regulations generally would result in highly sensitive and controversial projects having looser rather than stricter administrative controls. MK Naomi, the Fort Detrick CIA project for the research and development of chemical and biological agents, provides another example where efforts to protect the security of agency activities overwhelmed administrative controls. No written records of the transfer of agents, such as anthrax or shellfish toxin, were kept, quote, because of the sensitivity of the area and the desire to keep any possible use of materials like this recordless, end quote. Footnote 81. I'm going to read the footnotes before proceeding. Footnote 78. Memorandum from ADDP Helms to DCI Dulles, April 3rd, 53, Tab A, page 2. Footnote 79. Memorandum from IG to Chief, TSD, November 8th, 63, as quoted in Memorandum from Chief, Audit Branch. Footnote 80. The memorandum suggested that administrative exclusions, because of the importance of such decisions, should require the personal approval of the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence on an individual case basis. Present CIA policy is that only the DCI can authorize certain exemptions from regulations. Footnote 81. Sidney Gottlieb Testimony, October 18th, 75. Hearings, Volume 1, page 51. Resuming and finishing page 88. The page 89. Result was that the agency had no way of determining what materials were on hand and could not be certain whether delivery systems such as dart guns or deadly substances such as cobra venom had been issued to the field. B. Authorization. The destruction of the documents regarding MKUltra made it difficult to determine at what level specific projects in the program were authorized. This problem is not solely a result of the document destruction, however. Even at the height of MKUltra, the IG noted that, at least with respect to the surreptitious administration of LSD, the, quote, present practice is to maintain no records of the planning and approval of test programs, end quote. Footnote 82. While it is clear that Ellen Dulles authorized MKUltra, record is unclear as to who authorized specific projects, such as that involving the surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting human volunteer subjects. Even given the sensitive and controversial nature of the project, there is no evidence that when John McCone replaced Alan Dulles as the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, he was briefed on the details of this project and asked whether it should be continued. Footnote 83. Even during the 1963 discussions on the propriety of unwitting testing, the DDP questioned whether it was, quote, necessary to brief General Carter, end quote, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, and the Director's, quote, alter ego, end quote, because CIA officers felt it necessary to keep details of the project restricted to an absolute minimum number of people. Footnote 84. In May of 1963, DDP Helms told the Inspector General that the covert testing program was authorized because he had gone to the director, briefed him on it, and, quote, the director indicated no disagreement, and therefore the testing will come, end quote. Footnote 85. Such authorization, even for non-controversial matters, is clearly less desirable than explicit authorization. In areas such as the surreptitious administration of drugs, it is particularly undesirable. I'm going to pause right there and I'm going to read the footnotes. Footnote 82. IG Report on MKUltra, 1963, page 14. Footnote 83. According to an assistant to Dr. Gottlieb, there were annual briefings of the DCI and the DDP on MKUltra by the chief of TSD or his deputy. However, a May 15, 1963 memorandum for the record from the Inspector General noted that Mr. McCone had not been briefed in detail about the program. Mr. McCone's executive officer, Walter Elder, testified that it was, quote, perfectly apparent to me, end quote, that neither Mr. Cone nor General Carter, then the DDCI, was aware of the surreptitious administration project, quote, or if they had been briefed, they had not understood it, end quote. Elder, December 18th, 75, page 13. Mr. McCone testified that he, quote, did not know, end quote, whether he talked to anyone about the project, but that no one had told him about it in a way that, quote, would have turned on all the lights, end quote. John McCone testimony. February 3rd, 76, page 10. Footnote 84. According to Elder's testimony, quote, no deputy director, to my knowledge, has ever been briefed, or was it ever thought necessary to brief them to the extent to which you would brief the director, end quote. Footnote 85. IG Memorandum for the record, May 15th, 63. On the question of authorization of the covert testing program, Elder testified as follows, quote, but my reasonable judgment is that this was considered to be in the area of continuing approval, having once been approved by the director, end quote. The theory of authorization carrying over from one administration to the next seems particularly inappropriate for less visible, highly sensitive operations, which, unless brought to his attention by subordinates, would not come to the attention of the director. Finishing page 89. Yet, according to the testimony, page 90, before the committee, authorization through lack of agreement is even more prevalent in sensitive situations. Footnote 86. The unauthorized retention of shellfish toxin by Dr. Nathan Gordon and his subordinates in violation of a presidential directive may have resulted from the failure of the director to issue written instructions to agency officials. The retention was not authorized by senior officials in the agency. The director, Mr. Helms, had instructed Mr. Karamessines, the deputy director of plans, and Dr. Gottlieb, the chief of Technical Services Division, to relinquish control to the Army of any chemical or biological agents being retained for the CIA at Fort Detrick. Dr. Gottlieb Dr. Gottlieb passed this instruction on to Dr. Gordon. While orders may be disregarded in any organization, one of the reasons that Dr. Gordon used to defend the retention was the fact that he had not received written instructions forbidding it. Footnote 87. In some situations, the existence of written instructions did not prevent unauthorized actions. According to an investigation by the CIA's Inspector General, TSD officers had been informed orally that Mr. Helms was to be, quote, advised at all times, end quote, when LSD was to be used. In addition, TSD had received a memo advising the staff that LSD was not to be used without the permission of the DDP, Frank Wisner. The experiment involving Dr. Olson went ahead without notification of either Mr. Wisner or Mr. Helms. The absence of clear and immediate punishment for that act must undercut the force of other internal instructions and regulations. One last issue must be raised about authorization procedures within the agency. Chemical agents were used abroad until 1959 for discrediting or disabling operations, or for the purpose of interrogations with approval of the Chief of Operations of the DDP. Later, the approval of the Deputy Director for Plans was required for such operations. Although medical staff sought to be part of the approval process for these operations, they were excluded because, as the Inspector General wrote in 1957, quote, operational determinations are the responsibility of the DDP, and it is he who should advise the DCI in these respects. Just as it is he who is responsible for the results, it is completely unrealistic to consider assigning to the chief medical staff what, in effect, would be authority over clandestine operations. Footnote 88. Given the expertise and training of physicians, participation of medical staff might have been useful. Questions about authorization also exist in regard to those agencies which assisted the CIA. For instance, the project involving the surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting, non-volunteer human subjects was conducted in coordination with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. There is some question as to the Commissioner of Narcotics' knowledge about the project. On to the footnotes. Footnote 86. Mr. Elder was asked whether the process of bringing forward a description of actions by the agency in getting approval through the absence of disagreement was a common one. He responded, quote, it was not uncommon. The more sensitive the project, the more likely it would lean toward being a commonplace practice, based on the need to keep the written record to a minimum, end quote. Footnote 87. Nathan Gordon Testimony, September 16th, 75, Hearings, Volume 1. Footnote 88. 1957 IG Report. End of page 90, beginning of page 91. And I will stop this episode here, and I will pick back up next time.